Pam Bondi didn't walk into that hearing room like a villain. She didn't have to. By the time her shoes touched the marble tile, the cameras had already cast her that way. She sat dead center back rigid, fingers interlaced in front of her like a barricade built from years of Fox News interviews and legal muscle memory. This wasn't some sleepy panel on judicial ethics. This was a confrontation, years in the making. A reckoning, not with what she said, but with what she allowed. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She didn't wait for the chair to bang the gavel, didn't glance at her notes, didn't warm the room with pleasantries. She just locked eyes with Bondi, leaned slightly forward, and launched the question like a guided missile. "You've held titles. But what exactly did you hold the line for? Not a gasp, not a cough, just the kind of stillness that falls over a room when everyone senses the line between policy and pathology is about to be erased." The air tightened. Bondi didn't blink, but her posture strained slightly as if the seat beneath her had stiffened. The cameras didn't pan. They crept, because they could tell the real moment wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be precise. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice either. Her tone stayed flat, but the words carried the weight of something far heavier than rhetoric. "Are you here to defend the law, or to redefine it?" This wasn't a trick question. It was a trap door. The kind that opens beneath someone who thinks they're standing on precedent, only to realize it was power all along. Bondi stayed silent, but her jaw flexed once, then again. Somewhere in the second row, a reporter scribbled without looking up. The room just changed temperature. No one applauded, no one moved. It wasn't that they were unsure what they were witnessing. It was that they knew exactly what they were witnessing and didn't want to miss a second. It's funny how a room built for dialogue can become most honest when no one speaks. The silence after Crockett's opening lines wasn't an absence. It was a presence, a pressure. Like gravity remembering it has a job to do. And in that silence, Bondi sat not as an expert witness, but as a symbol of what happens when legal authority is traded for political insulation, of what it looks like when the firewall between justice and ambition is slowly, methodically breached. They say hearings are about truth. That's only half true. Sometimes they're about exposure. Not of facts, but of patterns. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to prove Bondi was corrupt. She came to prove Bondi had already proven it herself by never intervening, by never objecting, by choosing silence when the law begged for clarity. And so, this wasn't the start of a testimony. It was the start of an excavation. Not just of a record, but of a role played too long in the dark. If Bondi had answered quickly, the room might have exhaled. If she'd responded with outrage or defiance, the headlines might have had a fight to cover. But she didn't. She held her breath. And that, more than any statement she could have made, told the story. Crockett didn't need to press. She just watched. Because sometimes power doesn't fall. It folds. Quietly. Publicly. On camera. And somewhere, between the lack of an answer and the weight of the question, the committee realized this wasn't going to be a hearing. It was going to be a reckoning. One wrapped not in shouting or slogans, but in the unbearable heaviness of watching someone try to hold their ground, only to discover the ground was already gone. It was almost poetic, if poetry came laced with contempt and broadcast live on CS Pan. The screen behind Pam Bondi flickered to life with all the casual menace of a subpoena in a silk envelope. There she was. Not in some grainy leak or anonymous recording, but in glorious high definition, seated at a closed-door policy meeting, tilting forward like a general leaning over a war map, delivering her doctrine with the elegance of a guillotine. The president doesn't have to bow to every liberal judge trying to block his agenda, she said. And then, with the kind of finality usually reserved for military strikes or bad Tinder dates, if it's about national interest, we move. Period. Not a pause, not a hedge, not a comma's worth of legal nuance, just the constitutional equivalent of a mic drop, performed not by a pundit or press secretary, but by a woman who once swore to uphold the law without fear or favor. The room didn't gasp. It exhaled, as if bracing for impact. Crockett didn't embellish. She didn't need to. She let the words hang, unedited, unaided. We move. Period. It was almost charitable how she repeated them, like reading the last line of a will to the person who wrote it. Bondi shifted. Not much. A slight hand adjustment, a throat clear, a paper shuffle. The choreography of someone who's rehearsed every defense but forgot to prep for the prosecution, quoting her verbatim. Still, she tried. That clip is being taken out of context, she offered, like a soggy umbrella in a constitutional downpour. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even a deflection. It was a plea for ambiguity in a room built for clarity. Crockett's gaze didn't waver. No context, no caveats, no ambiguity. Those were your words. It was the kind of sentence that should be carved into the walls of every oversight committee chamber in Washington. And Bondi? She didn't push back. She absorbed it like a wall trying to argue with the wrecking ball. The CNN camera zoomed in, slow as a gavel drop. Somewhere behind Bondi, a press aide marked the exact time on a yellow notepad. Not for record-keeping, but for damage control. Crockett's voice dropped, but the gravity only intensified. You didn't suggest. You commanded. You didn't analyze. You authorized. That distinction wasn't semantic. It was the difference between a lawyer interpreting law and a loyalist paving over it. Pam Bondi, the former top legal officer of one of the largest states in America, hadn't merely offered her opinion. She'd issued marching orders. And those orders, distilled to their purest legal heresy, translated to skip the judge, save the agenda. The absurdity of it all clung to the air like static. A former attorney general, someone entrusted with the stewardship of the law, was now arguing that national interest, however she chose to define it, could override judicial review. What next? Executive tweets as binding precedent? Maybe we could scrap Article 3 entirely and let Mar-a-Lago handle appeals. The comedy wasn't lost on the room, but no one laughed. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it had been real. Her words weren't satire. They were doctrine practiced, broadcast, and now played back for the nation to witness. And what was her defense? Context. As if we move, period, had been part of a haiku. As if the Constitution were a mood board, and Article 3 was open to creative reinterpretation depending on the lighting. Crockett, ever composed, didn't ridicule her. That would have been too generous. Instead, she let the silence stretch-lit Bondi marinate in the realization that her own voice had become the prosecution's sharpest blade. This wasn't about partisanship. It wasn't about optics. It was about one question. When the rule of law was tested, did Pam Bondi enforce it or enable its erosion? Her defenders might argue she was playing her role, But Crockett had just redefined the script, and Bondi, for all her preparation, had no lines left, no context to rewrite, no ambiguity to weaponize, just the echo of her own words, playing back like a confession dressed in patriotism. And if the room felt like it was closing in on her, it was only just beginning. Because what came next wasn't opinion. It was chronology. Dates, memos, silence. And the silence, like always, was louder than the spin. The transition was seamless, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a flourish but settles into the bones of the room like a second spine. Without raising her voice or shifting her weight, Jasmine Crockett reached for a Foldera slim stack of documents with bright yellow tabs that gleamed like legal hazard lights. She turned, not to the audience, not to the cameras, but back to Pam Bondi, and for the first time that morning, the phrase executive privilege felt like a punchline waiting to be humiliated. "Federal court orders," she said crisply, issued in 4 separate cases, each one demanding a halt to executive actions, deportation programs, visa revocations, and border policy enforcement, all ignored. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't need to. The file spoke louder than outrage, and Bondi, bless her seasoned PR instincts, blinked but said nothing. Crockett didn't pace or perform. She just let the record linger like a body dumped quietly at the front steps of accountability. "Did you or did you not?" she asked, voice sharp as a pinhole leak in a pressurized chamber. "Advise the president to ignore any of these court orders." Bondi's mouth opened just slightly. What emerged wasn't an answer. It was a linguistic yoga pose built to dodge gravity. Advice to the executive considers multiple layers of national interest, interagency coordination, and anticipated judicial review. A sentence that had more escape hatches than clarity, more syllables than honesty, more bureaucratic upholstery than spine. Crockett didn't interrupt. That would have been too generous. Instead, she let the dead air do the work, let Bondi's evasiveness become the evidence. She leaned back, then repeated herself, this time with the surgical rhythm of someone who's already pre-written the obituary. "Was your advice compliance or delay?" It was a binary question designed to collapse every committee, approved euphemism into dust. Yet Bondi, ever the legal gymnast, stayed suspended in that toxic middle space where words are used not to clarify but to camouflage. The room didn't breathe. Somewhere near the back, a pen clicked, the only sound in a chamber that suddenly felt colder than marble. Crockett slowly closed the file and laid it flat on the table like a tombstone. "You didn't hesitate to tell that room to move," she said, almost softly. "But today hesitation is all you brought. And that, more than any allegation, was the indictment." Bondi had once spoken with the urgency of someone declaring war on judicial review. Now she was hiding behind footnotes and process maps. Bondi bit the inside of her lower lip not enough to bleed, just enough to confirm she was still made of flesh. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't need a headline. She didn't even need Bondi to confess. All she needed was to expose the delta, the chasm between how quickly Bondi had urged action when it served the administration, and how meticulously she now parsed language to avoid accountability. This wasn't about a court ruling anymore. It was about muscle memory, how reflexively power learns to protect itself. And there, in that fluorescent, wood-paneled vault of institutional theater, Bondi wasn't just on the defensive. She was malfunctioning. She wasn't standing on principle. She was sinking in precedent. And every second of silence wasn't just avoidance. It was testimony. Not to what she said, but to what she enabled. Crockett had struck the nerve, exposed the pattern, and forced the witness into a place Washington dreads more than scandal: unmistakable clarity. And this was only the beginning. Because if ignoring court orders was bad, wait until someone asked how those decisions were justified, buried, or worse, forgotten by design. There's a moment in every political interrogation when the witness stops speaking and starts sweating, not because the question was unfair, but because the answer would be. Pam Bondi had reached that moment. Her defense, if one could dignify it with that term, came wrapped in bureaucratic silk. Not all judicial rulings are constitutional in nature. A phrase so smugly academic it could have been lifted from a law school exam if that exam were written by someone trying to argue gravity is optional depending on the altitude. Crockett didn't flinch. She tilted her head, her voice curling with the kind of incredulous calm only a seasoned trial attorney can weaponize. "And who determines that, Madam Attorney General? You or the judiciary?" It wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical. And in that instant, Bondi didn't just represent the Trump-era Department of Justice, she embodied its entire neurosis. The belief that the law is a suggestion and loyalty, a constitutional override. There was a beat of silence, just enough for the cameras to catch Bondi preparing a response, a blend of technocratic detachment and bureaucratic poetry. The executive must weigh multiple constitutional interpretations, especially under emergency circumstances, she said, her voice attempting the impossible, to sound both authoritative and unbothered while hemorrhaging credibility. Crockett didn't blink. She simply reached into her folder and pulled out the next act of this carefully orchestrated unraveling. An internal memo from Bondi's own office describing a federal court injunction as non-binding guidance. That phrase hung in the air like the smell of a burned oath. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Non-binding?" she asked, eyes narrowing. "A federal injunction?" The disdain wasn't theatrical, it was clinical. Because calling a federal injunction non-binding is like calling a defibrillator optional during cardiac arrest. It's not just wrong, it's willfully, theatrically, embarrassingly wrong. Someone in the second row, a Republican staffer, judging by the lapel pin shifted uncomfortably. A Democrat beside Crockett muttered just loud enough to be caught by a hot mic. She's not just parsing language. She's rewriting law. And that was the essence of it. Bondi wasn't engaging in interpretation. She was performing surgery on the very notion of judicial authority without anesthesia and without a license. Crockett paused for a moment, then delivered the blow not with volume, but with precision. "You didn't interpret the law," she said. "You replaced it with loyalty. It wasn't a statement. It was an indictment. One that didn't require a jury, because the gallery had already rendered its verdict with posture, glances, and the kind of collective stillness that only follows the public execution of a defense strategy." What made this exchange so grotesquely compelling wasn't the legal acrobatics, or even the gall of the argument. It was the fact that it had become doctrine within the walls of an administration that treated judicial restraint like a PR inconvenience. Bondi had the audacity to frame constitutional interpretation as a task to be carried out by the executive, conveniently bypassing the branch whose entire job is literally spelled out in Article 3. She wasn't defending legal theory. She was laundering power through semantics. And worse, she expected the room to applaud her for the effort. No one did. Not the committee, not the aides, not the press, because everyone in that chamber understood exactly what had just happened. Pam Bondi had peeled back the curtain not on some secret scandal, but on the strategy itself. Delay the law, diminish the courts, redefine loyalty as legality, and sell it to the public as stability. Crockett didn't need to expose a crime. She just had to quote the process out loud. And that silence that followed? It wasn't the end. It was just the inhale before the next revelation. Because if a federal court order could be dismissed as a suggestion, what else, exactly, had this administration decided was optional? And who gave them permission to decide? Of all the absurdities that had already surfaced, nothing punctured the illusion of lawful discretion quite like what came next. A $400 million aircraft, gleaming on the screen behind Pam Bondi like a monument to impropriety, gifted from the United Arab Emirates to the President of the United States. The jet didn't arrive wrapped in secrecy, it arrived on schedule. And yet, somehow, neither Congress nor the Department of Justice had anything on record. No alert, no memo, no internal review. Just a line of text beneath the image, as sterile as it was damning. No congressional notification. No DOJ memo. No review triggered. The words didn't shout. They whispered something worse. Permission disguised as oversight. Bondi cleared her throat and attempted the usual diplomatic two-step. It was a diplomatic gesture within bilateral cooperation frameworks, she offered, like someone explaining away a suitcase full of cash as a souvenir. The phrase was technically elegant and morally bankrupt, like polishing handcuffs and calling them jewelry. Crockett, however, didn't blink. She nodded once, slowly, as if to acknowledge that Bondi had just walked directly into the trap she'd laid. Then, with the composure of someone citing an autopsy report, she reached into her folder and retrieved the Constitution. The emoluments clause, Crockett said evenly, doesn't say unless the intent was symbolic. Her voice was flat, deliberate, designed not for drama, but for burial. She read the text aloud like scripture. No person holding any office shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept any present. There were no footnotes, no exceptions for friendly sheikhs or luxury aircrafts packaged in foreign policy ribbons. Just the original ink of the founding document, plain, inflexible, and utterly incompatible with the excuse Bondi had just attempted. Bondi tried again. This time she argued there had been no personal benefit conferred, that the gift was not accepted individually. The strategy was classic Beltway misdirection, deflect the act by questioning the recipient. But Crockett was already 5 steps ahead. She projected a timeline behind Bondi's seat. Date of delivery, date of press conference with UAE officials, date of silence from Bondi's office. The screen looked less like a legal defense and more like a procedural obituary. You didn't redact the gift, Crockett said quietly. You redacted the law. And with that, the air in the hearing room dropped 10 degrees. Even Bondi's own aides paused in their note-taking, as if they too had felt the gravity shift. The phrase wasn't a flourish. It was a verdict, cold and precise, a surgeon's line across the flesh of institutional integrity. The implication was clear. Bondi hadn't merely failed to act. She had actively removed the warning labels from a transaction that violated the very clause her office was sworn to enforce, and therein lay the grotesque comedy of it all. Bondi was not some rogue actor improvising in a vacuum. She was the architect of delay, the custodian of selective blindness, the gatekeeper who watched the gate swing open and said nothing because the man walking through it wore her party's colors. Crockett didn't accuse her of corruption. She accused her of complicity of letting the Constitution be rewritten in invisible ink, with exceptions scribbled in diplomatic euphemism and executive privilege. No one in the room dared ask what would have happened if the gift had come from China. Or worse, what if it hadn't been a jet, but a check? Because deep down, they already knew the answer. The outrage isn't in the gift, it's in the silence. The silence from Bondi's office wasn't bureaucratic. Caution, it was strategy. It was the calculated non-response of someone who understood that acting would invite consequences, and so opted for inertia draped in procedure. And as the chamber settled into that stifling quiet, the kind that doesn't ask for a gavel, only acknowledgement, Crockett's gaze never left Bondi. "You didn't forget your oath," she seemed to say without speaking. You reinterpreted it until it meant nothing. But she wouldn't need to spell that out just yet, because next she wasn't going after symbolism. She was going after silence, and the silence was about to scream. The room didn't breathe. 10 seconds passed. No papers shuffled, no water glasses lifted, not even the ceremonial cough from a bored backbencher. Jasmine Crockett said nothing, but her silence wasn't passive. It was surgical. Her eyes locked on Pam Bondi, like a microscope trained on the last living bacteria of plausible deniability. The cameras, God bless them, zoomed in just in time to catch the twitch in Bondi's lips and the single bead of sweat gliding down her temple like a guilty thought escaping protocol. Then Crockett leaned forward, barely, and whispered into the mic with the force of a closing cell door. Silence isn't absence of guilt. It's the architecture of complicity. It was a line meant not for debate, but for documentation. The press gallery twitched like a hive. One reporter jotted it down instantly with a note beneath. Silence just became evidence. It wasn't metaphor. It was a shift in the burden of proof. Turning to the committee, Crockett let the weight settle. "We were told loyalty to office is paramount," she said. "But since when does patriotism excuse erasure?" It was a question that punched sideways, one that didn't just corner Bondi, but also tickled the nerves of everyone who had, at some point, rationalized political cowardice as institutional stewardship. The sentence landed not as moral grandstanding, but as a dare. "Go ahead, defend the erasure on record." Bondi sat taller, like a seasoned TV guest snapping back to her script. "The nation needed stability," she said, voice steady but a shade too quick. "We avoided a constitutional crisis. It was the kind of answer designed in war rooms, part deflection, part sedative spray painted with gravitas, and served lukewarm." Crockett didn't roll her eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She cut the response at the knees. "You didn't avoid it. You postponed it, and wrapped it in protocol." She didn't need theatrics because facts were louder when whispered in full light. The line didn't just flatten Bondi's narrative, it rewired the entire premise. This wasn't a legal defense. It was delay dressed as duty, Silence sold as statecraft. And then something unusual happened, not from Bondi, but from behind her. One of the prior legal advisors, seated just outside the spotlight, shifted in his chair. His chin dipped, his hands locked, his eyes dropped. Not in shame, in recognition. He hadn't been addressed, he hadn't been accused. But Crockett's words had brushed past Bondi and landed squarely in his lap. The look wasn't theatrical, it was biographical. Because sometimes the most damning confessions aren't spoken by the guilty. They're mouthed quietly by those who finally recognize their reflection in the wreckage. And that's how Part 6 ended, not with a bang, not even a quote, but with a look that said, "You knew. You just never thought anyone would ask." But the questions were only beginning. Because if silence could be weaponized, it could also be traced. And the trail, as Crockett was about to reveal, didn't end with Bondi. It ran through the walls of the institution itself. It was no longer just a hearing. It was a reckoning measured in timestamps. Crockett turned toward the second monitor, this one smaller, colder, designed not to persuade, but to pin. A digital timeline filled the screen. June 14th. Aircraft delivered. June 17th. Press conference with UAE defense officials. June 24th. Internal silence. No legal memo, no advisory note, no emergency referral from the Attorney General's office. Just a clean, damning row of empty dates like gravestones for accountability. Not a single action recorded, just the passage of time, uninterrupted by responsibility. Crockett let it sit there like an exhibit at a crime scene. What did you do, Madam Attorney General, when the law was sidelined in real time? Her tone didn't rise, but it cut deeper than any outrage could. The question didn't seek clarification. It offered one last chance to claim oxygen before the truth drowned the room. Bondi straightened in her seat, tried to recover the illusion of procedural dignity, and replied with a phrase so deflated it should have come printed on a bureaucratic pillow. There was no formal trigger under existing diplomatic protocols. It was the verbal equivalent of filing a fire report after the house had already burned down, then insisting the alarm was optional. Protocols, in Bondi's framing, were not just shields. They were excuses gift-wrapped in footnotes. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't scoff. She simply placed a crisp copy of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 on the table in front of Bondiflat, centered and silent. The Constitution was the trigger, she said softly, like a eulogy for an oath Bondi had once sworn but apparently never read past the punctuation. No theatrics, no finger-pointing, just paper. But in that moment, it didn't feel like a document, it felt like a mirror. And Bondi, for the first time in the hearing, didn't look up. She didn't look at Crockett. She didn't look at the clause. She looked down. Because there's a specific kind of silence that follows a confrontation with your own legacy. Not defensive, not dismissive, but involuntary. It's the stillness of someone realizing the words they once treated as political decor were now returning with legal teeth. And Crockett? She wasn't there to wound. She was there to weigh. You didn't interpret the clause, she continued, voice cold, exact. You erased its weight. That sentence didn't need applause. It didn't need fact-checking. It had already happened, and everyone in the room knew it. The clause didn't fail to apply. It failed to matter because the one person meant to enforce it had treated it like an suggestion printed in decorative font. Crockett didn't glare. She didn't perform. She just let Bondi sit in the shadow of her own neglect. And as that moment stretched, not loud, not messy, just excruciatingly real, the real story took shape. Not about jets or gifts or diplomatic phrases, but about a clause in the Constitution that didn't disappear it, was simply made irrelevant by someone too loyal to power to lift the weight of the law. And as the silence returned, this time it wasn't aimed at Bondi. It settled over the entire chamber, like a collective realization that the greatest threat to the Constitution isn't the violation, it's the shrug that follows it. And Crockett was far from done. The clause was only the start. Next came the question of how many others had read it and done nothing. Pam Bondi, finding herself cornered not by ideology but by chronology, tried once more to summon the familiar cadence of control. Her voice, polished and postured, slipped into that well-worn register heard at dozens of press briefings, sequel parts gravitas and gaslight. "I served the presidency to preserve the institution," she declared, as if saying it slowly enough might make it true. It was the kind of line designed not for clarity, but for coverage. A headline without a heartbeat. A mission statement detached from the mission. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She tilted her head the way a surgeon might just before making the final incision. "Then explain," she said, voice low but tightening like a noose. Why every act of protection became an act of permission. It wasn't just a question, it was a time bomb with receipts. And just as Bondi inhaled to respond, the screen behind her came to life again. Same clip, same words. Played not to inform, but to indict. "If it's about national interest, we move. Period. Not taken out of context. Put back into it." This time, the clip wasn't a revelation. It was a reminder. This wasn't carelessness. This was choreography. The kind that wears patriotism like a mask while rewriting institutional boundaries in real time. Bondi snapped. "That was a deliberative advisory session," she snapped, the first sharp edge in her voice all day. But tone is no substitute for truth, and Crockett stepped in with the precision of someone who has spent her life watching powerful people fold under the weight of their own edits. "Intent," she said, "is only exculpatory when the outcome is harmless. But the outcome here? Power untethered." She didn't need to raise her voice because facts, when delivered plainly, are louder than drama. A Republican committee member leaned forward, clearly preparing to intervene, maybe to accuse Crockett of partisanship or tone or some procedural infraction, but then hesitated. Sat back. Even he knew this wasn't politics. This was math. Cause, effect, statement, outcome. And for once, the numbers didn't lie. There was no procedural rug big enough to sweep this under. Crockett stepped forward, not to intimidate, but to close distance. Her words slowed but sharpened. "You weren't safeguarding law," she said, each syllable like a thread being yanked from the hem of Bondi's entire defense. "You were laundering power." The phrase landed like a gavel wrapped in velvet. It was beautiful in its cruelty, surgical in its judgment, not a flourish, a fact. And that was the death knell not of Bondi's career, perhaps, but of her narrative. Because power laundering isn't about bribes or envelopes. It's about sterilizing violations until they look like protocol. It's about rerouting checks and balances through the back channels of executive spin and calling it governance. And in that moment, everyone in the room saw it. The defenders, the skeptics, even the aides with dead pens and open laptops. Bondi hadn't just failed to uphold the Constitution, she'd taught others how to bypass it with a smile. And Crockett? She wasn't there to take a victory lap. She was just getting started. Because if power had been laundered, the next question was obvious. Who else helped run the machine? Jasmine Crockett paused not for effect, but for alignment. Her gaze rose above Bondi, landing squarely on the row of former legal officials who had already taken their turns in the hot seat. Some shifted in their chairs. Others looked down, as if the very posture of recollection might spare them from proximity to what was coming. They all said the same thing, she said, voice low but undeniable. It depends. She let the phrase hang like stale smoke. So let's ask plainly. She turned back to Bondi, not with heat, but with a scalpel in her tone. If a federal court ordered a halt to deportation, and you believed the Supreme Court might reverse it, would you advise compliance or defiance? It was the kind of question that doesn't need elaboration, because it already carries its own closing argument. Bondi didn't speak, but her hands, previously folded like press conference origami, now clenched into pale geometry. The silence wasn't uncertainty, it was calculation. She knew what answering meant, and more importantly, she knew what not answering had already confirmed. Crockett didn't wait. She'd seen this dance too many times before. The president doesn't have to wait on law, she said flatly. That was your doctrine. No sarcasm, no elevation, just a mirror, held inches from the face of institutional decay. Behind her, someone in the audience, young, suited, credentialed, pulled out their phone, thumb already moving. It didn't take long. Within seconds, Twitter lit up like a Christmas tree in a blackout. On MSNBC's live stream, the chyron updated mid-sentence, no fanfare needed. Compliance with a man is not fidelity to the law. It wasn't commentary. It was translation. Because what Bondi had normalized in bureaucratic Latin, Crockett had just decoded into moral English. The country wasn't watching a legal argument unfold. It was watching the anatomy of abdication be dissected in real time. Bondi remained frozen, not out of principle, but out of risk management. Because whatever she said next wouldn't be heard as legal nuance, it would be replayed as precedent. And the thing about precedent is, once it's spoken, it can't be unsaid. Crockett didn't need her answer. She had already extracted the truth, not through confession, but through hesitation. And sometimes, hesitation is the purest form of revelation. No gavel slammed, no partisan snark cut through the room, just the steady hum of recognition as those watching on Capitol Hill, at home, in legal circle, realized what had just happened. A doctrine had been cornered, exposed and rebranded for what it truly was, an ideology of convenience, dressed up as interpretation. And Bondi, for all her titles and televised poise, now found herself standing not on legal ground, but on the wreckage of her own evasion. And Crockett? She didn't blink, because the next question wasn't going to be about doctrine. It was going to be about decisions. Who made them? Who buried them? And who stood silent as the law was redefined in real time, one shrug at a time? The microphone dropped, not with a clang, but with the soft finality of a conclusion that didn't need permission. Jasmine Crockett lowered it like she was sealing a file that would never be reopened. No gavel followed, no closing statement, no performative motion to adjourn, because the room didn't need a verdict. It had already watched one unfold, silent, brutal, and irreversible. Pam Bondi sat still, shoulders back, posture intact. But she was no longer in the center. The cameras had moved on, not physically, but narratively. No lens lingered. No anchor teased her next soundbite. That was the signal. The shift more telling than any vote count or headline. The story no longer belonged to her. She was no longer the protagonist. She wasn't even the antagonist. She was a footnote to her own moment, eclipsed by the silence she had once wielded like armor and now wore like a muzzle. Crockett stood slowly, scanning the room not with pride, but with precision. Then, without raising her voice, she delivered the final blow not with fire, but with weight. "If the Attorney General won't enforce the law," she said, "who will?" It wasn't a question. It was a surrender flag for every institution that had looked the other way and called it prudence. On the other side of the dais, a lawmaker gave a small nod, not performative, not political, just a gesture that said, "We saw it, and we can't unsee it." In the press gallery, someone typed without blinking. That wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Because what Bondi had faced wasn't a partisan grilling or a career-ending ambush. It was something rarer. It was accountability, uncurated, unspun, and finally unmuzzled. And as she rose from her chair, there were no murmurs, no aides huddling close, no final attempt to control the narrative. She exited like someone whose orbit had quietly collapsed. Not disgraced, but displaced. Not toppled, but abandoned. Outside, the clips played on loop. Not the policy points, not the procedural exchanges, just that single closing image, Bondi blinking into a silence of her own design. And the line that began repeating across networks, podcasts, and timelines wasn't a soundbite. It was a shift in public memory. She was supposed to protect the law. Today, the law protected itself from her. No press statement followed. No rebuttal was issued. Because there are moments that aren't just politically devastating, they're narratively irreversible. And this was one of them. A cautionary tale told without metaphor, ending not in applause but in a camera turning away. Not because the story was over, but because its center had already vacated the stage.